Next week, we're going to start our new season, The Real Free Speech Threat, covering the growing criminalization of environmental protest around the world. It's our first big cross-border series, and it will include dozens of stories both in the podcast and online. One thing we'll be looking at in that series is the media's role in enabling this trend. Before you can criminalize protest, you have to vilify the protesters. And to do that effectively, you need the media's help. Evlondo Cooper at Media Matters reviewed media coverage of climate protest in the U.S. from May 30th, 2022 to July 31st, 2023 for a new study. He documented a trend that we've been seeing too. Not only has the U.S. media perpetuated the idea that climate protesters are uniquely disruptive and radical, but their general failure to cover anything about climate protest other than the disruption that they cause further perpetuates this thinking. Evlondo's research found that while multiple national outlets have run stories about climate protesters being annoying and destructive, not a single broadcaster has run even one story on the fact that nearly half of the states in the U.S. have now passed laws criminalizing protest. That fact is both shocking and worrisome. We're going to get into all of that and more with Evlondo after this quick break. I'm Amy Westervelt, and this is Drilled.
How does PwC take your company to the leading edge? They bring the sharpest minds in tech to your team so you can bring the ideas that will transform your business. They're passionate about your industry so you can walk into any room with every advantage. And they're with you every step of the way so you can know you're headed in the right direction. PwC builds for what's next so you can get there now. Get started at pwc.com/us/leading edge.
The Abercrombie Kids Summer Sale is in full swing, with up to 50% off select styles for the season. Summer plans, vacation, and camp days are all covered, with new dresses, shorts, tees, and swim. Abercrombie Kids has the summer staples they need and the looks that they want to wear. Shop in-store, online, or in the app. Offer applies to select styles as indicated. Discount applied at checkout online.
Hey, it's Paris. You know I love sparkly things, right? Like stars. Duh. And thanks to Hilton and AutoCamp, I just slept under them. Picture me, serving looks by the fire outside my luxurious Airstream, making s'mores with the kids, while a national park is our backdrop. The great outdoors meets Hilton hospitality. That's hot. Explore all the new ways to stay at Hilton.com. Hilton for the stay.
So I wanted to start by just asking you, what prompted you to start looking at how media was covering climate activism?
Yeah, so I had been seeing these infrastructure laws, the steady march from state after state of the criminalization of protests generally and climate protests specifically. And so I wanted to see how the media was covering it. The problem was we knew that the media wasn't covering specifically the criminalization of climate protest. And so seeing this kind of global surge in climate activism, specifically around kind of provocative climate actions and civil disobedience, we thought that was a way that we could kind of get at understanding how media was covering climate protests generally and to see if they were adding some context to these protests.
So yeah, I know that just purely anecdotally, whenever I pitch a story that's related to protest, it's kind of a hard sell. You know, it's like, what's really happening? Is it new? Nobody wants to cover a particular action because then it feels like you're just doing PR for the environmental organizations. What do outlets, when they do cover protests at all, what are the sorts of stories that you're seeing?
So the vast majority of the stories were kind of dry recitals of what happened. You know, first, there still wasn't even that much coverage of, I guess, these more controversial climate actions, right? So we have to put that in context. That I think a lot of these actions are designed for kind of social media virility, but it's important for me to understand that, you know, social media is its own kind of activism, But I think there are also a lot of persuadables, older people, older voters, um, who were trying to get on board with understanding the need for urgent climate action, who still get most of their news from mainstream sources. So that's why we wanted to kind of focus on the kind of traditional corporate news media environment. All you would see really is just a dry recital of, a specific action. You didn't get any context about the urgency behind the action, why the people were protesting. And to me, it called to mind there have been a lot of really great justice movements that have employed controversial tactics, and there are good faith disagreements within those movements themselves about which tactics to deploy. But I think a lot of those would have been much less successful if people didn't really understand why they were protesting in the first place. And so the media presenting these climate activists as just disruptors, as nuisances, as knucklehead kids who don't really know what they're doing or why they're doing it, um, paved the way for me, which I think is a more dangerous trend, which is where you have an organization like Fox News, which covered the protests with way more than other mainstream news outlets. And their coverage was full of derision, climate denial, and mocking, and even calls for violence against the protesters. So I think you have a mainstream news environment that when they cover these protests, they cover them as just the most basic kind of headline news rundowns. These activists did this at this, gallery, or they protested this sports event. There's no climate context. There's no context about the escalating criminalization of their protests. There's no context about the violence being directed at them. And then you have a network swooping in and filling that gap with these are bad people who are protesting a fake thing and they deserve whatever they have coming to them.
That's so interesting, just how much the vacuum creates the ability to kind of do the Fox News style coverage and have it land too. But yeah, it's been very interesting to me to see how much the coverage focuses on, how disruptive these kids are. And like even so, the example that is top of mind to me right now is the recent New York Times piece where they talked about the art protests and how they're
Mm-hmm.
costing museums money, right? and, and I like completely coincidentally, I happened to be interviewing Joanna Altman Smith the same day that story came out, right? So like she's one of the people who protested at the National Gallery. They put
Mm-hmm.
water soluble kids finger paint on the display case of a Degas statue in the National Gallery. So like not an incredible amount of damage, very easy to clean
Mm-hmm.
up. They read a manifesto and talked actually a lot about why they were doing this and whatnot. And she she told me, she's like, I spent hours and hours talking to the reporter who wrote that piece about all of the reasons why like it was worth the risk for us. And by the way, this is someone who's facing a charge as a person who is conspiring against the United States,
Yes, it's insane.
which is insane. She's facing 10 years in jail and $500,000 in fines for this action. She has had her passport taken, and none of that was in the story. Like there was nothing about the reason for the protest. There's nothing about the overwhelming weight of the charges compared to what the action itself actually cost. So anyway, it's really interesting because I feel like that kind of framing really helps the criminalization of protests because
Yes.
it like makes all of these protesters seem like annoying mosquitoes, right? It's very dehumanizing. Was there anyone that you saw doing a good job of covering this? And like, did it tend to break down across sort of expected lines in terms of mainstream media versus smaller or more independent outlets?
Yeah. Well, okay. So on the broadcast side, no. I mean, they didn't cover it enough for it to even be meaningful. Um, on cable, not really either. I mean, it was it was sparse coverage, and what it was kind of, like you said, just a kind of dry recitation, with no context. The newspapers provided a more nuanced picture. The Washington Post published the most stories, and this is just looking at print because I know there were some online specific articles that were really harsh against the climate protesters, and there were someone that were really kind of wonderfully defensive of their actions. And you saw that kind of coexisting on the print side too, which to me is problematic because you're sending mixed messages to your readers. I know you're trying to present a kind of broad outlook on this, but like you said, any article that doesn't include the context about uh, the scale of the protest versus the scale of the response, to me, is not doing its job. So, but you did have a more nuanced picture among the print outlets. The New York Times published one or two decent pieces. So I think the overall, I can't say though that there were very many standouts because among print, any standouts were kind of negated by harsh, chastising, or decontextualized articles that didn't present the whole picture. And I think part of what what angers me about this is that a lot of these papers, and especially on cable news, CNN, NBC, present themselves as democracy defenders, right? But when it comes down to it, the people who are actually practicing democracy, in the best tradition, civil disobedience on behalf of a righteous cause,
Right.
there are these draconian responses to them, whether it's legally or through the police. You had a forest defender murdered in Atlanta for
Yeah.
protesting a police facility. And this doesn't get covered, it doesn't get contextualized. And so instead of being democracy defenders, while they're good on, the kind of right wing Trump stuff, they're completely falling down to me on the people who pose the biggest threat to with the system, which are climate activists, leftist protesters who are being demonized, dehumanized, as you mentioned, and being criminalized. And this gets no attention in this corporate media sphere.
Yeah. Did you look at all at whether there was any difference in how publications covered different types of activism, whether there's any difference in how they cover a climate protest versus something that's more like general interest democracy kind of thing? I feel like I see a lot more annoyance with the climate
Yeah.
protesters than I've seen with other types of protesters. And it's really interesting to me. I'm like, where is this coming from?
So we don't have a data point for this, but I can definitely say that there is no small measure of respectability politics at play with
Mm,
regards to these specific protests, right? Because they cover Earth Day, right? It's not particularly great coverage, but Earth Day receives generally positive coverage, at least amongst the mainstream news. The youth climate protests for a few years ago, right, were generally well received. They're deemed to be, proper way of protesting. Marching in the streets, holding signs. When it comes to anything slightly more subversive or direct, you do see a lot of this hand wringing, specifically with regards to climate. You could argue that the BLM protests were disruptive, they were loud, they were aggressive, and they got their point across. But the media didn't cover them like they covered climate activists, right? Because rightfully so, criminal justice, demands for criminal justice and racial justice are deemed to be worthy causes, and the protesters are given more leeway in how they agitate for those causes. But something about climate, where if it's not done in this very specific way, this very kind of old school style protest, anything slightly provocative is really integrated and it's viewed as illegitimate.
yeah, we did this episode, Mary and I, when we were doing Hot Take. We did this episode maybe like 2 or 3 years ago, talking to Rev Yearwood about how, like in the early days of the environmental movement, a lot of the environmental organizations were very specifically not wanting to engage in either class struggle or racial equity. And part of why they had created this whole separate environmental thing was to be like, we're not engaging with that. and and now I feel like climate has become a broader movement and it has become more of a challenge to certain class and racial problems as well. And I wonder if, like, I don't know, maybe it's just as simple as like, hey, it's a threat to capital.
I mean, let's get to the core of it, right? I mean, the core of the problem is that the media, despite certain instances, we're talking about broadcast and cable news right now. They don't really do a great job on climate already, right? Climate is not a top priority. It's not covered like it needs to be. It's not providing the context and substance it needs to be, right?
Right.
Outside of a few moments and a few instances. So already climate isn't taken seriously enough by these
Right.
corporate news outlets. Then on top of it, you add climate-driven protests. And then you add climate-driven protests that are deemed disrespectful or illegitimate because of the form of protest. You have this ready-made recipe to either ignore or distort what the protests are. And then you add on the threat that they pose to vested interests like the fossil fuel industry, because all of the demands are to, immediately transition away from a fossil fuel economy in order to thwart climate change. You got to add that messaging in as well. I mean, it's a perfect recipe for poor coverage.
Yeah. Have you gotten any sense in looking at all of the coverage that maybe part of it too is the way that controversy sells, having a bad guy always kind of, brings people into a story. There's just that kind of framing happening too to make the story more interesting.
I mean, definitely I mean, that's the thing, right? On
Mm.
the Fox side, definitely. You know, However you feel about these protests, they are designed to get media attention, and they do get a lot of social media attention. I thought they would be getting a lot more attention on broadcast and cable news, but they didn't, which is why Fox saw a ready-made villain for their audience, and they seized it. They seized that narrative and they hammered it home time and again. What you got from mainstream corporate news was basically indifference,
Yeah.
which to me, yeah. So it's weird. You have protests designed to grab media attention, and it got mostly indifference from the mainstream media sources. But Fox definitely saw that narrative that you point out of a ready-made villain. I think you were talking about the weird tenor of the coverage around the protests.
Yeah.
Yeah, another weird thing for me, which I would have at least captured in some of the methodology, right, is the media's complete lack of concern for the surveillance capitalism state that
Yep.
is literally being built around us in the shadows, and you don't hear about it at all. And to me, more so than even protests, it's a direct threat to how journalists can do their job.
Totally. Yeah.
Timeless.
It's really interesting. And I wanted to ask you too about the I know I've seen several stories in this vein, and I'm curious if you saw this emerging as sort of a thread, but I do see coverage of like who's funding these activists, and not just in the Fox News, Soros checks kind of way, but like, the the New York Times. Sorry, New York Times. But they ran a story, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, where the focal point was that like a lot of the organizations that are funding activism, their money comes from oil heirs, basically.
Yes, yes. Yes.
But it was very much in this like Soros checks kind of framing. And again, there wasn't much in there about why the individual people showing up to these actions felt compelled to be doing this work. And the idea that someone would be engaging in activism as their job is like really vilified in the media. Like that automatically means you're not credible,
Mm.
you're biased or whatever, like you're a paid actor, that kind of thing. And I mean, I don't know, I'm like people have to eat and pay rent. I don't think it's terrible for someone to devote their life to something that they actually feel strongly about. That's usually applauded in many areas of society. So yeah, I'm curious what you've seen on the coverage of the money side of things.
Yeah, I remember reading that article, and they seemed more upset that she was a class traitor than anything, right? I mean, you know, I think transparency and funding of journalists can dig into that stuff and highlight it. I think it informs public discourse, but it's very
Yeah.
one-sided
Yeah.
because ALEC is pushing a lot of these infrastructure laws, and the fossil fuel industry is behind them, is
Hmm.
funding them to push the criminalization of protest, domestic terrorism, all this kind of draconian stuff. But you never hear about this industry who's being greenwashed in the mainstream media on the backhand, pushing laws that literally undermine democratically protected protests. So,
Yeah.
yeah, if you want to cover the money trail, cover it for both sides, and I think you'll find much
Mhm.
deeper pockets on the fossil fuel end than you will on a few rich progressives funding some climate activist groups.
Yeah. I can't think of a single mainstream outlet that I've seen even cover the critical infrastructure laws, which like seems like a pretty big deal. HuffPost has covered it, The Intercept, Unicorn
Yes,
Riot, these kinds of outlets. The Guardian has covered it. That seems like it would make for really good TV, that story, you
right.
know?
I, I always think like the journalists, print and online journalists work so hard. These stories are already prepackaged, right? So building a news segment around it to me doesn't seem like that big of a stretch because most of the work's been done, but you
Yeah.
still don't see it. Like I
And
say,
then,
I don't
yeah,
understand.
because it's been very well documented that the fossil fuel industry funded that work. The American Fuel and Petrochemicals helped to write the legislation. I mean, it's
Literally.
you know, it's all there. In some ways, like we're doing this series and some of the stories I'm kind of like, isn't that old news? But I'm like, well, it hasn't actually really broken through somehow to people that this is happening. And I also feel like actually it has bipartisan appeal. When I talk to people who are otherwise fairly right wing about, and I don't even tell them that it's related to climate protest in particular. I just talk
Right,
about
right.
criminalization of protest. They're like, that's not right. What? That
Yeah.
shouldn't be happening, So I don't know. It's very strange.
I mean, there are people in my life who I love and who get their news primarily from kind of the main corporate. They don't get much of their news from online news sources or independent news sources. And yeah, they don't, every time I publish something or share something with them, they have no idea that this stuff is going on.
Yeah,
I mean, no idea. And to me, that's a
totally.
complete dereliction of duty.
Yes, especially when you're talking about laws that criminalize sort of a key part of democracy in this way. It's really shocking that it's not
Right.
everywhere. In general, I feel like we just are so far away from the media kind of taking any responsibility for this stuff.
I mean, I guess it wouldn't matter as much if so many voting age people still didn't primarily get their news from one of
Yeah.
these mainstream news sources. And
Yeah.
I think these are people that we need to reach in order to actually drive climate action, to put pressure on politicians and policymakers. And I think that's why it's so important. If they're not hearing about any of this stuff,
Yeah.
it's just only going to get worse.
Yeah. Is there anything that you found in the study that we didn't talk about already that you want to make sure people know about?
I think the media, they think that if they mention climate change or connected to an extreme weather event, that is an improvement. But this is what should have been happening 10, 20 years ago. What they
Right.
don't understand is that they have to rapidly improve their coverage to catch up to where we are now. We're way
Hmm.
past just mentioning climate change and being like, hooray, you mentioned climate. I mean, thank you for doing it. Again, keep doing
Yes.
it. But
Yes.
but you have to like rapidly scale up um, the quality of your coverage. And I just don't. I think they're still caught up in. Well, we're mentioning climate. We're saying extreme weather, but we're
Yeah.
way past that, and they need to really. And the more people, more groups can agitate for that kind of rapid improvement and
Yes.
shame them, I think the better.